terribly hard. Another thing to watch is in the master cylinders, we just, every 4 or 5 years or so many 100 hours, 300 or 400 hours, we change the O-rings out of those master cylinders because they wear, and you don't want to lose a brake when you need it. and when sometimes those O-rings roll over, it goes to the floor. And you don't have time to pump it back up, and it may not pump back up. So we like to change those just as preventative maintenance. Another item on back, we kind of like to watch the rudder trim bell crank. The first couple of years they made the 195, that wasn't in there. But the later ones it is, and the springs that hook to it can wear the holes out. And those need to be watched and rebooted if they get worn, and so that they don't tear out. And then another thing in the back of the tail we didn't talk about, we need to probably mention, is the steering cables. That come off the walking beam back there to your tail wheel. We have had people come in and say, this thing, I don't have any steering. It just feels like it wants to go anywhere it wants to go. Well, the cables were not crossed. And so it was steering backwards, if they got any steering at all. And we found the tail wheel steering arms on backwards on occasion, or a cable of the spring broken back there, and so that's a very important area to watch, and on the steering of the tail wheel.
I think it's, to emphasize that, John, it's important to make sure that the 195 is maintained by people that have experience with the 195. Because you're absolutely right. Somebody takes a look at those tail wheel cables and they're crossed, and they say, oh, it shouldn't be that way. We'll make them straight. And then, of course, it steers the wrong way.
Right.
Little idiosyncrasies like that. What else do you think we ought to talk about?
Well, there's ADs we kind of look at when we're doing pre-buy or, of course, on an annual, either one. There's not very many. There's a rudder cable AD, and there's some pulleys under the floor, right under the control column. And in the couple first years they made them, they put a smaller pulley down there.
Now that just applies to the early one.
Just to the early ones. And I didn't look up the serial number, but it's not too terrible many of them. And the fix is, of course, to change the bracket and the pulley, and that is not an easy task. That's best done when the belly skin's off. When we rebuild one, we watch for that and get the big pulleys in there. Another one is the elevator hinge area on about the same basic serial numbers. They had some cracking problems around the outboard aileron hinge. And that's another thing to watch for. That's an AD. But again, that's on the early ones, and if they've been reinforced, that's taken care of. Another area that's not an AD is the weight on the end of the elevator. The spar just has a little tab that bends forward to hold that rib, and those will crack on occasion. And if that happens, that needs to be gotten into and reinforced.
Okay, can you see that crack?
Yes, yeah, you can just see it by just looking in there. And then we were talking about, I guess, the wing spar is another area, and that was an AD back in the early 60s, and it had to be x-rayed and a steel bar put on the front and back because they had a failure. And I think I understand, in all the x-rays, they only found one more cracked.
Well, I think that was a one-time AD.
That was a one-time, but it recurs every year just for a visual to look at that center section in there.
Right after I bought my 195 in 1963, I got hit with that AD.
Well, I was a new A&P when that come out. I was working with a fellow that had two 195s, and he had to have both of them done. And I didn't do it personally, but they went down to Yingling and Wichita to be done.
Okay, what's the future for this particular airplane?
Well, it'll be going back home whenever it's finished.
Where's home?
Down by Houston.
Okay.
And this one, in the ground loop, they don't know for sure, I guess, which happened first. A little bit of a ground loop, and then it broke a gear leg, or the gear leg broke. But we are experiencing some gear leg breakage, usually with the heavy gear, or more so than the light gear. And this one did have light gear. And it kind of looked like this gear might have had a hairline crack starting underneath it. And it breaks right where it comes out of the gearbox in the wedges under there. And that's another area to watch for on an inspection, is to make sure those wedges are tight.
Now, if a 195 is a relatively high-time airplane, you're going to buy it or have it first annual, do you think it's a good idea to pull the gear legs and have MagnaFlux?
That's getting to be pretty much a recommended procedure. Ray in California is kind of recommending that every time you overhaul the engine, every say 1,200 hours or so, that you do the engine, that while you got the engine off, just pull the gear legs and let's magnaflux and shot peen them.
That's probably not a bad idea.
Yeah, and that shot peening gives them, that's the way they were manufactured originally. After the heat treat, they were shot peened to give that surface hardness.
All right. Anything else you think we ought to talk about with the new owner or the prospective owner in mind, if he's looking for an airplane?
Now, I guess another area we were visiting about earlier was the toilet seat bulkhead.
Oh, yeah, the bulkhead.
And that's the aft bulkhead in the tail cone, and the tail wheel attaches. And if the tail wheel is not kept serviced properly and starts bottoming out and banging, you can crack the lower part of that bulkhead where the wheel attaches, where that strut attaches.
Okay. Well, John, I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule working on these 195s to talk to me. And I know that over the years that I've known you, you've done a lot of good work on my airplane, and I really appreciate it.
Hopefully we've had some help.
This upper door post problem is becoming more prevalent as the fleet ages. And I think it's vitally important that if you're looking at a 195, one of the first things you do is have a knowledgeable mechanic who knows what he's looking for take a close look at this area up here. All right, now I'm going to give you my opinion, and that's strictly what it is. Take it for what it's worth. I don't believe that the upper door post problem is necessarily related to time on the airframe or age on the airframe. This airplane has 6,400 hours on it, and the doorposts are fine, knock on wood. I think the ones that have the problem with the doorposts are those that have been abused, have a history of damage, particularly ground loops. Another factor to consider, I think, is a heavy gear. The heavy gear is stiffer and imparts more shock to the airframe, and over the years that could be a problem. But another thing that I rarely hear anybody talk about, but that is tying the airplane down outside with chains instead of ropes. Chains have no slack. They a lot of shock to the wing when the airplane rocks in the wind, and when that chain hits the end, that shock travels all the way down the spar and into this upper doorpost area. Something to consider. Now, let's run on down to Florida and visit some dear old friends who have a gorgeous airplane on their own private airstrip. Located about 10 miles northeast of Ocala, Florida, in beautiful horse country, the private Idlewild Airport is the home of John and Sarah Hamilton. Although retired, John maintains a small shop, and the welcome mat is always out for fellow 195ers.
Well, Sarah, you and John have had your Cessna 195 since 1965, and Larry and I have had ours since 1963. They're part of the family, and we've been so many places in it. It's such a wonderful airplane to travel in. Where have you been in yours?
Let's see, Jenny. John and John Jr. flew to Baja, California when John was about 10. We've made a very nice trip to Alaska. We had a nice trip with the 3 children to the Bahamas. And, of course, many, many trips to Canada and many places in the United States.
Right. We've been to Alaska, too, in ours. We've been as far north as Fairbanks, and we've been to Mazatlan in Mexico. And like you say, all over the U.S. Like you, we belong to the Cessna International 195 Club. And with their annual meetings, we've been to Ottawa, we've been to Toronto, we've been to Oklahoma City, back to Wichita, take the baby birds home, and all over the U.S., New Orleans. I just can't think of all the different places we've been. And through that club, we've met so many wonderful people like you and John and so many other friends that we only see once a year, but it's just like family.
Exactly. We consider them our second family.
Absolutely.
Right.
And traveling as much as we do, one big advantage of the Cessna 195 is the huge baggage compartment. We can put everything in it we need, right?
Exactly. 3 weeks' worth of stuff easily.
And you said you have an ox?
We have an ox baggage in ours, and you can put extra things back there. Yeah. Tennis rackets, golf clubs, fishing poles, dirty laundry.
That's always a problem. What else? Let's see. When we go to Oshkosh, my gosh, what we put in it then. Tents, sleeping bags, everything you need. Chairs, tables, and I even carry a porta potty. So anything you want to put in that plane, I think you probably can. So you have a beautiful home here in Ocala, and thanks for inviting us down to visit with you and shoot the video.
You're welcome to Idlewild anytime.
Oh, thanks.
Come again.
Thanks, Sarah.
Wow, two great ladies. I don't know what John and I'd do without them. I also talked to John while we were down there. But before I get to that, let me tell you a little bit about John Hamilton. John retired from the Air Force in the 1970s after a long, distinguished career as a fighter pilot and a test pilot. His father was a World War I fighter pilot and also was one of the 3 original founders of Pan American World Airways. After retiring from the Air Force, John and Sarah set up an FBO in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, where for many years they sold lake amphibians and really ran a very successful operation. Retiring again in the 80s, they moved to Idlewild. John is an A&P, an AI, and one of the most knowledgeable 195 people there is. He's a real asset to those who live in Florida. And on top of that, he's a real nice guy. John, you live every pilot's dream. Here you've got a gorgeous home on your own grass airstrip in a beautiful part of Central Florida. I don't know. I just envy you.
And not only that, Larry, I've got my own Cessna 195.
At least I got one of those.
Yes,
and they're both sitting out here on your grass strip. As we talk, we're looking at them. John, I know that you're a very experienced AI. You're very well known in the 195 circles and in the Southeast. And if anybody wanted to bring an airplane to you for a pre-purchase inspection, the key is they'd have to bring it to you, right?
Yes, Larry, I do occasionally do things if people will bring them to me. I'm supposed to be retired. And as I pointed out before, the name of the airport here reflects that. Since I retired, I'm idle. My wife is wild, so that's where the name came from.
Sarah's wild?
Yes,
I didn't know
she is.
Sarah was wild. She hides it well.
Right.
What would you advise, what advice could you give to a prospective 195 owner about what to look for in the airplane?
Well, Larry, of course, the advice is the same as for any airplane you're going to buy, is a good inspection and a good check of the paperwork trail, records in Oklahoma City. But peculiar to the 195, I can think of a few things. Corrosion is an important thing to look for, particularly up in the wings. The wing spar caps are prone to corrosion. They're made of some material that's prone to corrosion, and when they do, they swell up and start popping rivets. And it's easy to see.
You can
from
see
outside.
that from outside
Yeah.
here. Okay, good.
Sure. And there's a Cessna service bulletin concerning cracks in the doorpost bulkheads.
Okay.
Cracked doorposts. And that's what holds the airplane together. The doorposts hold the wing to the fuselage and the landing gear and everything. So it's a major operation. The repair for a crack is to replace the bulkheads.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to have that service bulletin signed off.
And by somebody that knows what he's looking for.
Absolutely. Because I've missed one.
Yeah.
Aileron hinge brackets. It's very hard to see. They are, it is possible to have cracks in the aileron hinge brackets that are very hard to see, so it's important to have a real good look there because it's almost impossible to find a replacement for them.
Mm-hmm. But you know, it's amazing. There are very few ADs on the airplane, right?
That's correct. There's just a few ADs on the airframe, and none of them very important, and no ADs on the engine or the propeller.
That's really incredible. You know, Mort Brown, who for many, many years was the chief of production flight tests at Cessna, flew every model, tested every model, and I just read where he says that the Cessna 195 is the best airplane Cessna ever built.
Yes, I know. He said that's his favorite airplane.
And what do you feel about it?
The same way.
I do,
It's a
too.
wonderful airplane. It's big, and it's rugged, and it's reliable, and it's fast enough. I've said many times that 3 people wide, I've had 3 fat gals on the back seat.
Does Sarah know that?
Yes, Sarah knows all about
All right.
that. She was there, not in the back seat.
Okay, she wasn't one of the fat gals, no.
And I have a Honda 90 motorcycle that goes in the baggage compartment, comes apart. So it's plenty big and plenty rugged.
Well, you know, you and I have both had our airplanes for over 30 years,
Mm-hmm.
well over 30 years. And I got to know you through the 195 Club many years ago. And I've met some of our best friends today are people we've met through the 195 Club, and we certainly include you and Sarah on that list. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you so much for inviting us.
Well, Larry, we're delighted to have you and want you to come back anytime.
Oh, that's great. I might take you up on that.
All right, great.
On the way home to Colorado from John and Sarah's, we stopped by Guthrie, Oklahoma to visit the only engine shop currently specializing in the overhaul of Jacobs engines. Radial Engines Limited is located on a farm north of Oklahoma City and is about the only game in town if you're looking for an overhauled Jacobs engine. Steve Curry owns and operates this place, and in addition to being very knowledgeable, he's also one of the nicest people you meet in the business. I got him talking about our beloved Shaky Jake, so let's listen. Okay, we're here to talk about the Jacobs engine, which the 195 is equipped with. Yes. And also, we want to talk about the Continental engine that's equipping the 190. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about the Jacob engine? The difference in models, which is the best, and problem areas, and that sort of thing.
Okay. The original Jacobs engine was the R755-9 245 horse engine. Those were produced by the tens of thousands during World War II, and so it was a natural at the end of World War II when the Cessna 195 was produced. It was a natural to go on that aircraft. Simultaneously, Jacobs came out with the 300 horsepower engine, which utilizes many of the same parts as the 245, but has a higher compression piston and also breathes a little better. From the end of the war until 1952, these were basically your two factory engine choices for the 195. In 1952, Jacobs found themselves with literally thousands of the 245 horse engines, which weren't selling that well. So they took the piston cylinder combination from the 300 horse, put it on their 245, and the 275 horse engine was born.
How about that?
And the 275 proved to be really their best engine, reliability-wise. It's just a great engine. Also, the other Jacobs engine that you might find on the Cessna 195 is the 330 horse L6 engine, which was produced during the war for the Avro Anson in Canada. That was not an original engine on the 195, but is STC'd for the 195, and there are several flying. So those are basically the Jacobs engines that you'll see commonly on the 195.
I have always heard that the 300 had a problem with case cracking.
Yes, it did. Probably when you overhaul these engines, you'll lose about one case in 4. Mm-hmm. I've never seen one fail catastrophically. It's just that upon overhaul, you inspect the case for cracks and find that about 1 in 4 is cracked.
Yeah, and that's the 300, right?
On the 300.
Okay.
The 275s and the 245s almost never crack.
All right. Now, I understand with the 330, which makes quite a performance boost to the 195. Mm-hmm. Problem has always been with shortage of parts, pistons and rods particularly.
It has been. It was a much lower production engine than the 245, 275, 300. But one of the big problems, the Achilles heel for the 330, has always been the piston. Was not a good design with the piston. We are in the process right now of correcting that problem. We have a piston that has a much better design, much better ring configuration, and we have those pistons manufactured right now, and we're working with the FAA for approval on them. I really think that this will revitalize the L6 and make it an engine that will be very desirable for the 195.
That's great. That's great. Now, some people are looking at 190s. There's still a few of them around with a Continental engine. What can you tell us about that?
It's a good engine. Not a bad engine at all. Shares many parts with the 220 Continental, and the parts that it shares with the 220 Continental are in great supply, no problem at all. However, the 240 horse itself was a very low production engine, numbers-wise, and so the parts that are very specific to the 240 horse are rare. Main bearings, oil transfer rings, pistons, those are very, very difficult parts to find. And so, as a result, many people that are buying 190s with a good running engine on them, fly the engine until it's run out, and then convert to a Jacobs just because of the part situation with the 240 Continental.
Of course, we should mention if they do that, they have to get a new mount, new cowl.
They do.
Firewall forward.
Yeah.
Sometimes that could be a problem.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. All right. Now, the other differences with the Jacobs are the battery ignition system.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The Jacobs is a little unlike most of the other radials in that it has on the left side a magneto like we would find on everything else. On the right side, it has a distributor, which is something that you would find on your Packard.
Old Packard.
Old Packard, yes, and so that's a little bit different. It doesn't produce quite as hot a spark, but on the other hand, it has the advantage of having a mechanical advance inside the distributor, so that it retards the ignition for starting, and you don't get the kickback like you do on engines that have the dual magnetos.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, and I understand parts were a problem for that too.
They have been in the past. That is being remedied to a large degree now by several different people that are manufacturing parts now for the battery ignition.
Yeah, the rotor, the coil, and those were hard to come by.
Yeah.
Now, as far as problem areas that a prospective owner should look for,
okay,
what should he check on the engine?
I would say that probably the most important thing would be to go back through the logbooks and inspect it for who did the overhaul, how long ago was the overhaul done. You could certainly go over the engine for oil leaks, check it for compression. An oil analysis is oftentimes not that helpful because until you've established a baseline for oil analysis, you don't really know what you're looking at.
That's right.
But you could certainly check the screens for metal. Do a good pre-buy inspection on the engine.
One of the weak points on the Jacobs is the aluminum link rod, which bends rather easily. You want to talk about that?
It does? Sure.